Last time we were talking about invasive species, I was wearing the same sweater, probably had the same polish on my fingernails, which is still all chipped now, and I think I've only shaved once. But I also promised you that if you wanted to learn more about the nuances of invasive species and the definition of such, we'd be taking a deep dive into that. This is not that video entirely. Instead, it's the first part of that video because, boy, is this a topic. So I want to go over some of the techniques and metrics that scientists and policymakers and whoever else use when they want to determine if a species should be considered invasive. However, I think my last video, What is an Invasive Species?, pretty much suffices as an introduction to this one. And we'll go ahead and outline some of the definitions that we'll be covering in this video and the subsequent ones. By the way, this video will have some citations so that if you would like to learn and review the things I had to learn and review while making this video, did you hear that too? Well, check the description and, you know. I'll be right back. So first, in today, we'll talk about the definition provided by the U.S. Department of Interior's Invasive Species Advisory Committee. Sounds really fun, I bet. This definition offers some general guidance about how to classify invasive species based on 5 species attributes and 4 comprehensive impacts. Sounds great. So, this video is already getting long. Let's just begin this journey. USDOI ISAC. We won't spend too much time with this one, as it's very broad and unspecific, and while it's helpful in understanding some concepts in the future videos, it hasn't quite the practical applicability with which I would like to equip y'all who are kindly taking the time out of your day to be here learning with me and shit. So if you'd like to skip it and move on to the next subjects, I'll make sure to have a button, like, right here, so that you can just go on right ahead to that. But I'll have you know that the best way to understand why one thing is right is by understanding what isn't right. And that's what we're going to do today. So, according to my acquaintance Isaac, there are 5 attributes which a species must fulfill in order to even be considered for final selection. Invasive species. What did I say? So first of all, and off to a rocky start there, Isaac, it says that an invasive species, in order to be invasive, must first overcome a significant geographical barrier. It must somehow cross over ecosystems in which it cannot survive on its own and arrive somewhere in which it can become invasive. It doesn't have to be far, but the geographical barriers must be significant. I mean, I guess being transported from the top to the bottom of a mountain is a pretty significant geographical barrier, and that does count according to Isaac's definition, along with, say, crossing an ocean. So let's just address the big glaring spot on this federal government definition of something. Invasive species are ordinarily exotic, and they do often have to overcome massive geographical barriers. However, this ignores literally every other alteration to an ecosystem that could make it more susceptible to invasions from certain species. I mean, consider species that are not overcoming massive geographical barriers, but maybe just migrating across unfragmented habitat due to climate change, and thus coming into contact with ecosystems with which it did not co-evolve. possibly having a negative impact. Or a species could cross the distance because human alterations to the landscape have made it possible for that species to migrate. Perhaps they adapt well to the conditions that humans put in place. Or just how about, like, is a species really alien if it finds its new habitat on its own? Even if it doesn't usually go there, like historically, is that still an alien species? I'll let you decide for yourself on that one. Go duke it out in the comments. And then I'll just move right on along to number 2, survival barriers. That being environmental pressures which a species has to overcome in order to establish itself in its new habitat. And as with most plants, or just most species in general, those environmental survival pressures are at their most intense when the species is still a propagule. Ooh, a propagule. That sounds cool. What was that? Could get me high? I don't know. Maybe, I guess. Go try some. But I do know that a propagule is any organ or part of a species which it uses to generate new individuals of that species. That can be sexually or asexually. A plant can, say, get pollinated by another plant of the same species and produce seeds, which are distributed somehow. Or it can just be a wizard and never have sex in its whole life and just, like, produce new versions of itself as an extension of itself, like with stolons. Okay, let's make another one. This seems, to me at least, like a much better place to start when defining an invasive species. Survival barriers. Many species only become invasive because the barriers which prevented them from establishing have been altered or removed. And I would argue that you could probably lump massive geographical barriers on in with survival barriers. Overcoming geographical barriers is just overcoming features of an ecosystem, which is just overcoming survival barriers. They are the same thing. If a rat crosses an ocean, you know, I'd call that a geographical barrier, yeah, but it's also a survival barrier. Rats are not supposed to be able to survive the ocean, so you get my point. And of course, survival barriers can also just be certain conditions within an ecosystem, like when a certain ecosystem both has a lot of highly specialized species who strictly fulfill very specific niches, and a lot of highly generalized species who can adapt to fulfill multiple niches. There's, in these settings, a lot of competition and not a lot of room for novel species to establish themselves. Or just disturbances could suffice as a survival barrier. You know, they do all the time. It's like kind of their thing. You know, wildfires, it's a pretty major thing. It takes a long time for species to become adapted to that. So, stands to reason that getting rid of it might allow new species to come in. Or it could just be something else, literally anything else, like how the subsoil is composed. If a subsoil has high clay deposition and degradation, all of these things are survival barriers. And again, getting from point A to B against all the odds just sounds like another survival barrier to me. 3, establishment. To be a real invasive, you must be established, or no one will accept you. So, why don't you just go? And by that, I mean that, according to ISAC at least, a species cannot undergo multiple recurring reintroductions in order to sustain its populations. It must be self-sustaining in its new habitat, and thus, at length, genetically distinguishable from its parent population. This is a tough one. In many cases, it's easy to tell that, like, yeah, multiflora rose will do just fine on its own. You really don't need to plant any more of it for it to keep destroying forests. But what about stuff that causes lots of destruction and reduces a lot of ecological functionality, but is just constantly reintroduced, constantly reinstalled in places. Take Poa pratensis, for example, one of many species that's commonly used for turf grasses. Yeah, it escapes cultivation and can certainly devastate and dominate an ecosystem. But also in the upper Midwest, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but as long as there is a healthy stock of native species propagules nearby with access to an ecosystem that's been devastated by Poa pratensis will lose its dominance eventually. So because it can't always support itself around here at least, without continual human care and introduction, does that not mean it's an invasive species? Despite all the destruction it still causes in the time that it does dominate? I mean, there's a lot of implications that can kind of fall under that. Does this imply that something is not invasive if it has value to humans, even if that value is 100% arbitrary? Furthermore, does that imply that humans and whatever we do to ecosystems are exempt from this spectrum of invasive to non-invasive? Whew. Let's come around back to that one. Number 4, rapid spread. Okay, all right, Isaac. Man, cut me some slack. Woo! So the 4th invasive attribute is that the species spreads rapidly through the available means in the ecosystem. Okay, first question. What does rapidly mean? Relative terminology, not conducive to science. Okay, and what if a species is spreading rapidly through the available means? Do Homo sapiens not count as an available means? Like, if we spread and cultivate something, even if it has value to us in some way, if we can make it up, is it not invasive then? You're really contradicting yourself here, Isaac. I mean, you're also saying that a species can't be invasive unless it overcomes a massive geographical barrier, which it can only do usually with humans. So where do you want us to pin, these species? What do you want us to do here? These attributes are painfully unclear and contradictory. But otherwise, rapid spread, yeah, that could still be applied. I suppose that could refer to like, hey, kid, those birds really love your berries and your bush. You're going to be a superstar. We're going to spread you far and wide. Everyone's going to know who you are. You just wait, kid. I guess that works. All right. 5, impact. And finally, where this falls apart. And we haven't even gotten to the second part. According to the United States' own designated experts on invasive species, to be considered invasive, the negative impacts of a species must outweigh the benefits. You're killing me here. There's a lot we could say, an old genderless child, my brother in Christ. We will say some things, but first let's just chug right along to the second part. The 4 comprehensive impacts that a species must fulfill in order to be considered invasive. And I invite you to really look for the patterns and what the impacts are that the federal government is looking for when determining if something is invasive or not. The first one, environmental. That's right, all of the environmental, hydrology, geology, nutrient cycling, soil disturbance, erosion, and all that kind of stuff. Virtually, or maybe not because it's hella vague, I don't know. The entire foundation of what makes an ecosystem. That being, in and of itself, the entire foundation of what makes a civilization. That is just 1/4 of the comprehensive impacts we have to consider when determining if something's invasive. This is driving me a little crazy, and I think so is this. What? It's just coffee. Second, human health. Oh yeah, can't forget that human health, baby. Happy, healthy, wealthy men with oily pecs. Ooh, yeah. All those other species, forget them. Human health, baby. Diseases, malnourishment, pollution, toxins. No, baby. Not for me. That makes you an invasive species. And if it affects anything else, well, everything else is only just as important as me. Why am I doing this? Did I write this? Third, natural resources. Now, to be fair, confusingly, a lot of things that might also fit under just general environmental impacts are listed under here. But when you read on a little further, it seems that ISAC's thinking in this designation was that this section is meant to discriminate between natural resources which are economically significant to humans and ones that aren't. Let that sink in for a moment. I'm not even sure how to comment on this one, except that all natural resources are important to all species. Because all resources are important to an ecosystem. And we cannot thrive as a species without generally holistically intact ecosystems and a diversity of other well-balanced ecological communities. ISAC makes at least 6 references in this review to livestock as something which it deems that, once impacted, would determine a species as invasive. In all of these examples, when taken in context, livestock pretty much just means cattle, and sometimes horses. Cattle, a completely introduced species, which has overcome a great geographical barrier thanks to humans, only survives here due to severely altered ecosystems, and causes a litany of ecologically degrading impacts. In fact, is not just arguably, but definitively one of the most environmentally destructive industries in this country. But that's not invasive. No, God forbid a weed which we also brought to this country should poison our beloved beef tanks. For the love of God, I wonder who wrote this one? Who wanted this? Wonder who could have possibly wanted a scientific review to be written like that. Well, one of the probably innumerable suspects is revealed by the 4th impact that ISAC lists, which is to recreation and property values. Just as important as all the environmental impacts possible, as all the human health impacts possible, is the property values. Won't someone think of the landlords? Oh! I want to make it clear that even though I'm being so very rude about this, there are legitimate points sprinkled throughout, such as in this recreation section, it references the negative impacts that could be had upon hunters. But not because hunting is a recreation should we worry about that. No, we should worry about that because not only is hunting a sustainable and accessible source of high-quality food for tons of families throughout this country, but it is also one of the most effective ecological stewardship techniques at our disposal, and not only fulfills a lot of the niches essential to our ecosystems, but funds the further restoration of many of those ecosystems, encourages the motives for the restoration of those ecosystems. That is why impacts on hunting should matter. Not because of all those hunting clubs that aren't selling as many subscriptions. That's not why we should be worried. That is not protecting people's livelihoods. I think the most important thing that we learned from ISAC today is that you should always, no matter what no matter which peers have reviewed what university-backed whatever frickin' thing, always wonder why it's being written. And I know that probably gets said a lot. It's probably something, it's not original. I know you've heard that before, right? But just doesn't matter who is writing it. Always question why something is written or implemented in the specific way that it is, even if you agree with it at first glance. And I know that's not the lesson that you might have come here for today, but that actually is the lesson today. With environmental sciences being such a infant subject, with a lot, just a profusion of complexities and variables to be considered, it's really, 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 really easy to be misled, or for information to be misconstrued, or decontextualized, or stripped of all nuance and subtlety. And that's what ecology is all about. Just like history or sociology or so many other subjects that we really need to pay some attention to if we want to figure out how to, not get totally screwed in this next generation or two. There's just so much that can be overlooked or just deliberately... Did you hear that? Altered. And I earnestly caution you regarding the definitions and descriptions that our policymakers and other governing institutions offer us. Read through this ISAC review. It's down in the description. See for yourself. And maybe while you're at it, just guessing, try to count how many lines or sentences in there you think are saving money for an inherently ecologically degrading industry. Or hell, make it a drinking game or a smoking game. You won't make it. You'll be absolutely domed, lint-licking, finger-sniffing, fucked up before you get to the end of that paper. In other words, if reviews like this, even if not legally binding, are designed to set a precedent or guidelines for Americans and American companies to refer to or follow, who benefits the most from these precedents? And we can make that even easier. If you go and read it for yourself, I want you to ask yourself this. Who benefits more from these definitions? You or Home Depot? A hunter or the Nebraska Beef Council? Lucky for us, you and I, here in this room, video, whatever, despite all of our opinions and feelings and biases, we will not accept the first thing that validates our dispositions, nor the second thing. So let's get a little more scientific, a little more academic. Look, I know you came here for a lesson on invasive species, but what we got to talk about today is essential to a lesson on invasive species and ecology in general. It's all very, very nuanced. In broad, vague attributes attached to disproportionately, suspiciously anthropocentric impacts are problematic. These definitions, such as ISAC proclaims, would not hold up in a scientific context. They would not be enough. And as you saw throughout this video, they leave a lot of room for interpretation. Please do not think that this is an oversight or an accident. Businesses with a lot of money will be making sure that the room for interpretation is great, and that the first interpretation through there is their own. But they're not the only ones who live in an ecosystem. Just remember, we all do. And I'll see you when we get into a neutral terminology for defining invasive species. But I think the most telling section is really just right down here in the summary. I'm gonna read it off just word for word, start to finish, all 2 paragraphs. I quote, "Invasive species are those that are not native to the ecosystem under consideration and that cause, or are likely to cause, economic or environmental harm, or harm to human, animal, or plant health.
Plant and animal species under domestication or cultivation and under human control are not invasive species. Furthermore, for policy reasons, to be considered invasive, the negative impacts caused by a non-native species will be deemed to outweigh the beneficial effects it provides. Finally, a non-native species might be considered invasive in one region but not in another. Whether or not a species is considered an invasive species depends largely on human values. By attempting to manage invasive species, we are affirming our economic and environmental values. Those non-native species judged to cause overall economic or environmental harm or harm to human health may be considered invasive even if they yield some beneficial effects. Society struggles to determine the appropriate course of action in such cases, but in a democratic society, that struggle is essential. Okay, invoking democracy to dismiss objective, measurable harms to our quality of life. I love it.